Welcome to World Business. Now, across global markets, companies spend billions trying to understand what drives consumer behavior. Data and psychology are often seen as the answers, but some experts argue the real force shaping our decision-making is culture, the shared beliefs and social rules that shape how we think and buy. Well, that's the argument in a new book called The Rules That Make Us. And I'm delighted to say joining me now is the author, world-renowned business anthropologist, Oliver Sweet. Ollie, very good indeed to see you. Thanks very much for joining us. This is one of those books that just gets you thinking. You know, you argue in it, don't you, that culture shapes behavior far more than psychology. For people out there that are leading businesses, perhaps watching today, what does that mean in practice?
It's a good question. And the divide between psychology and anthropology, or psychology and culture, is a fine one, but it's a very, very important one. Fundamentally, we need to recognize that people don't make decisions in a vacuum. They buy, choose, and behave according to lots of different social rules around them. And when you go into a new place or you're with a different set of people, you will act in a different way. So what's normal and respectable for one group of people might be quite different for another group of people. And you moving between those places and between those groups of people changes your opinion and what you're likely to do. And as a result, what you're likely to buy. So I like to say that actually, instead of trying to understand people's psychology, we need to understand the cultural rules that shape their decisions.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. And the world today, you know, companies, they rely so heavily on data, things like behavioral analytics, don't they, to try and understand customers. But your point is that culture often explains behavior better. It kind of, in a sense, beats that sort of traditional data. Why is that?
So we're not static people, we change. And one of the things that psychology has done really, really well is help individuals overcome trauma, issues with work, behavioral issues, all sorts of things in order to sort of get a sense of calm and happiness in themselves. And psychology focuses on the individual. But people don't make decisions in a vacuum. They don't make decisions on their own. And I think that a lot of the behavioral analytics that is largely based on psychology tells you what has happened, but it doesn't necessarily tell you why that choice was made and why that choice might be made in that moment. A lot of the companies that I advise for, they want to understand what a special moment might be, a moment of celebration if you're an alcohol company, a moment of family joy if you work in the food industry. Now, all of these things, the moment constructs how people make these decisions, and the community that you live in, the place that you are, that normalizes the decisions. And you see this also in organizations as well. Companies have company cultures. And we know that we all act in accordance to the company culture when we're there. Even then, sometimes we go home and say, "Ooh, not sure that was the best decision today, but I went along with it anyway." So these rules guide us a lot more than some of the analytics will tell us.
And some of the rules, Ollie, we might like to think are kind of obvious, but some of them are less obvious. You talk in the book about hidden cultural rules. Give us some examples of those rules that perhaps might be influencing us that we're perhaps not aware of.
I think the hidden cultural rules are some of the fascinating parts of being in a multinational corporate or traveling around the world, because when you go to a new place, you inadvertently break the rules all the time. I remember when I first went to China 15 years ago, and people were all communicating on WeChat, but they were all doing it through voice notes. And everyone was doing a voice note to each other, and you'd have this whole thread of WeChat conversations where it was just voice to voice to voice. Yeah. And then I tried to come back to the UK and get my team to do it in the UK. And they were like, "No, I cannot. I will not do voice constantly. So there are these hidden rules that you don't necessarily know about, but you can trip over them when you don't understand them. Procter and Gamble famously had a problem with their advertising. They did this enormous big budget advert for Pampers, and it was a beautiful advert where this stork was carrying a baby with a piece of cloth between its beak, and it would fly around the world, sort of showing how safe the baby was with Pampers, was the message. And this big budget advert did incredibly well everywhere. And it just absolutely bombed in Japan, and nobody could really understand. And then they did a bit of cultural insight to understand what was going on there. And they realized that the folklore in Japan wasn't that babies come from storks, lived by storks. The folklore in Japan is that babies actually come down the river in a giant peach, and the peach rolls up onto the shore, and a couple will slice the peach in half, and the baby comes out of the stone in the middle. So these wonderful bits of folklore that get imbued in advertising, in branding, and in products, they're different everywhere. So sort of understanding this around the world is always fascinating and interesting. And a lot of these things are quite hidden unless you know where you're looking.
Yeah, it's so difficult to understand things remotely, isn't it? And I think the more that you travel, the more you experience these cultures, the more obvious that becomes. Now, in the book, you introduce this thing, the cultural trinity: identity, community, and belief systems. Just give us a sense of how that framework could help businesses kind of better understand people.
So my attempt with the book is to try and make culture and understanding culture, and to be honest, changing culture, much more accessible for everyone. I think that there's a lot of advice out there on cultural change, which kind of feels like it's sort of done by wizards and people with magic. But actually, as a business anthropologist, I want to apply the ideas of culture in a very structured manner and in a framework. So the framework that I put in the book, The Cultural Trinity, basically helps people find a map of behavior from a cultural perspective. So everybody understands what people's identity are. It's the clothes you wear, how you want to look, and how you show up. Actually, from a business point of view, people buy products based on their identity. The community part of the cultural trinity is all about, who's in your group, what are those conversations, who do you hang out with? That's actually what needs to be reflected in good advertising and campaigns. We want to see a relatable story in our advertising. So understanding what goes on in a community is very important. And then the belief systems part is really what governs us as individuals. What are your values? What's your moral outlook on the world? And unsurprisingly, people want that reflected in the brands that they buy as well. So by using the cultural trinity, by looking at identity, community, and belief systems, we can help businesses transform what they're doing to be more product focused, more campaign focused, and have a brand that really stands for something. Now, you can do this with consumer facing goods. You can do this with tech companies. You can do this with internal workplace culture. It's a framework that's very adaptable and can be used pretty much by anyone.
Ollie, do you think we misuse this term logic? I remember seeing an interview with Stephen Fry, I think it was, years ago, and he said something along the lines of rationalists are fundamentalist extremists, right? He said, I'm an empiricist, which is a completely different thing. And I look at your book and some of your teachings, and I think many strategies, they assume that customers make purely rational choices, don't they? But you argue that that's rubbish. Cultural beliefs override so-called logic. Just give us an explanation of how that plays out in reality.
I wouldn't ever come up with a quote better than Stephen Fry, but I think that he's absolutely right. And again, one of the things that I've put into this book is that we have this battle in life between culture and cognition. Sometimes we need to engage our cognition. We need to understand what's going on. And more often than not, that might be in a very new and different situation. So if you're eating in a roadside cafe in Thailand and you don't understand the menu and you don't really know what they're going to cook. You really need to think hard about how you're choosing, pointing at ingredients. You need to think quite hard. And then you go, no, I don't like the look of that. It's been out too long. I don't like this. I would like something like that. Right? Then you do have to be logical. You do have to apply your brain. But so much of the time when we're acting on autopilot, like going to work in the morning and maybe spending too long chatting to a colleague or writing emails that you really want to write rather than the ones that you really need to write, or lots of these other things, you're swept along by culture all the time. And actually your cognition it has a rest, right? We can't be logical all the time because we would be exhausted. Culture gives us these shorthand ways of getting through the day, getting through life in a way that's smooth, in a way that's fun and enjoyable, but it's not very rational and it's not very logical. And sometimes we do many things like that are unhealthy to ourselves that are completely illogical and irrational. You need to go to certain parts of London on a Friday night to realize that people are acting in irrational and illogical ways, but they're being swept along by the culture.
Yes, yeah, very good analogy. And Ollie, I don't want to beat up too much on technology, but technology, social media, we know that it's reshaping communities, reshaping identity, what we do, how we do it. How is the digital world changing culture itself?
So I dive quite deeply into this in the book because I think that technology is reshaping culture, but it's also reshaping cognition in a way that we don't necessarily understand yet. So my work is to go and understand groups of people and understand why they do the things that they do from a cultural perspective. I do lots of work with young people, or Gen Z, as they're often called in these businesses. And one of the things I always need to understand as part of my study is, what do they do online? What's their social media habits? So I did some work in the US and in the UK where I looked at how much time people spent on social media per day. And the people that I was talking to, it was about 3 to 4 hours per day. Now, it seems like a lot, but it's not that shocking in this day and age. But if you work out what 4 hours a day is, and if you're very conservative about how long people dwell on a post, so say they dwell on a post for 30 seconds, which is too long, but some videos are long form, right? Say they were to do it for 30 seconds, that's 700 posts that they consume per day. And when I asked them how many they remember from the previous day, they could only recall 5 posts from the previous day.
Wow.
So what happens to the other 695 posts? We know from cognitive, behavioral and cognitive sciences that if you see something for up to 2 seconds, you register its presence. Now, some of the adverts and some of the posts that people are seeing are quite extreme in nature. So, and we also know, sorry, the lights have gone out in this room. We also know that that the algorithm promotes more extreme ideas.
Yes.
So what's happening is people are unconsciously seeing content that is more and more extreme, but they're not cognitively registering it. It's going in on an unconscious, deeper level, and it's influencing how they think, feel, behave, and buy, frankly. Now, in the 70s, there was a similar kind of act, which was called subliminal messaging.
Yes.
And as soon as everyone
click.
realized that they were splicing, yes, they would splice a little shot of drink Coca-Cola into a film. And it was only one frame. And then there was absolute outrage at it, absolute outrage, and governments banned it. But we do have a form of subliminal messaging going on in social media that's consuming our young people for 3, 4, 5 hours a day, that we're not necessarily fully in control of what the consequences are on that.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating stuff and worrying as well. Just going back to businesses, we often see, whether it's global brands or smaller, fast-growing businesses, we often see companies struggle when they enter new markets. You've spoken a bit already about the differences between geographic areas, different countries. In your experience, what are the biggest cultural mistakes that companies tend to make?
I have to say, I had about a 10-year period in my career where I was largely helping Western brands try and enter China as a market. And the most common mistake that everyone made is that they couldn't quite translate. There was a different belief system in China that related to everything that they were talking about. So, for instance, I tried to help a chocolate spread enter the Chinese market, and they really wanted it to be a breakfast occasion. And we told them that the Chinese consumers wouldn't eat chocolate for breakfast, and they don't have bread at breakfast, so you couldn't put this chocolate spread on the bread anyway. But they went ahead with it anyway, and it was a slightly failed launch. I think that if you take an idea around wellness, and wellness is I think it's estimated at a $7 billion industry at the moment, and forecast to grow. A lot of these brands see their growth happening in China. But the way that the Chinese see wellness through a model of traditional Chinese medicine, where you're trying to balance your internal heat constantly through the food that you eat, through the exercise that you take, through the amount of sleep that you have, I don't think these brands, when they're promoting a better toothpaste, are really thinking about this enough. And there are ways of doing it. There are ways of translating a premium product from a Western-style allopathic wellness to an Eastern-style TCM wellness. But the translation needs a big bridge, and it does cause a lot of problems. So that translation, for me, is often fundamentally about misunderstanding the belief systems of the market that you're trying to enter.
Yeah, very interesting indeed. Ollie, governments, like organisations, often try to change behaviour, don't they, through messaging or nudge units or incentives of various kinds. Why do those approaches fail, do you think, when culture isn't adequately considered?
I think that coming back to this idea that we sort of discussed at the beginning, that psychology focuses on the individual, and the nudge unit behavioral economics drive across a lot of governments have meant that we are trying to change behavior one person at a time. And we're not necessarily figuring out how people might act as a community, as a group of people. So the Dutch government introduced a lot of nudge tactics, and one of them was this very famous nudge tactic, which is make the system opt out rather than opt in. So, for instance, with pensions, they've done this in many countries, that when you join a company, you are automatically enrolled into a pension unless you opt out. And that has shown that more people actually take up a pension when they start in their workplace. However, the amount that people give has gone down. So the average previously was around 8% of your salary. And as soon as they introduced that nudge tactic, it went down to 4.5% because they went with the basics. They were told what to do. Another terrible example happened in Netherlands, where they used this same tactic of opt out rather than opt in with organ donation. So, previously people would opt in to organ donation. They would carry a card, and if they died, then if they had the card on them, the organs could be removed and repurposed for another person. Probably a bit clinical, not a nice way of putting it, but they changed that to an opt-out system. So theoretically, the whole population could be an organ donor unless you decided you weren't. Now, what they really didn't understand was Dutch culture is all about consensus. And actually, because they hadn't consulted the country on this, and because they didn't necessarily feel like everyone was on board with this, they had 66% of the country opt out. It was over 3 million people decided that they were going to go to the effort to sign up to a government portal and say, please do not use my organs for organ donation. And that almost certainly wasn't because they objected to their organs being used. It was because they rejected the way it was being done. And I think that this idea that you can nudge everyone into doing the right behaviors or the desirable behaviors all the time can really get on people's nerves as much as anything.
Yeah.
And we're kind of sick of it.
Ollie, and it fascinates me as well because I think perhaps there's a tendency amongst people to assume that because when I land in Singapore, the shopping centres look similar to the same shopping centres in Dubai, and they look similar to Westfield in London, and you sort of assume that therefore maybe those cultural differences of the past somehow have faded away, but of course they haven't at all. These are incredibly deep. They go back generation after generation. And yeah, fascinating stuff. Now, just on that, Ollie, final question. We've got people watching in 110 different countries. Your final pitch to them, business leaders, diplomats, if you had to make an appeal for how they should think about culture, how they should perhaps give culture more of a chance than they previously perhaps had, what would be your message?
I think it's that the answers are often hiding in front of us in plain sight. So I'm a business anthropologist, and I believe that we're all mini anthropologists, actually, because we're all really interested in why other people do the things that they do based on their backstory. Now, their backstory is all about how they grew up, where they grew up, and what the kind of cultural rules were there. So I think we have a tendency in life to focus on cognition, to think that we are the smartest people around and we can come up with the smartest ideas. But the ideas aren't necessarily in our heads. And I think those ideas are out there in culture right in front of us. And we just need to learn how to look for them a bit more clearly.
Ollie, great to speak to you. Oliver Sweet, author of The Rules That Make Us. We thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us on A News.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and that brings us to the end of today's programme. As Oliver Sweet has argued, culture, the shared beliefs and social rules that shape societies, often plays a far greater role in decision-making than data alone can reveal. Our thanks to Oliver and his team for joining us today. And that is all for this edition of World Business. Thanks for watching.